Thunderhead by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 5. Banner searched the wind. The mares and colts were grazing in a saucer-like depression of the upland. The stallion, a little above the cropping, the sweet tubular grass along the edge of a ridge in the hillside. Suddenly, he flung up his head and looked alert. His compact, red-gold body gathered and twisted to face the alarm, his legs thrust out against the irregularities of the rocky ground, his red tail and mane flying in the wind. For a few seconds he stood motionless, then moved into action. At a swift trot he circled the mares, his nose lifted, nostrils vibrating for the scent. It came now and again, just the faintest tang. He swept in widening circles, reaching his nose higher, his eyes and ears wild and eager. Up above him rose the pinnacle, topped with a craggy outcrop of rock. This was the highest point for miles around. From here, his long-range eyes could see the farthest moving speck, and his razor-keen sense of smell catch and identify all that was on the wind. He went up the steep sides without variation of pace or action, the long smooth muscles under his shining coat rippling effortlessly. He stood on the peak, 4 feet planted on the topmost spur of rock, his body sloping down. He lifted and swung his head, but he didn't get the scent. He went down again and began circling, nose pointed straight up, tail high and pluming over his haunches. Above him the deep blue sky bent low, and the solid white cumulus clouds hurried across it as if they were squeezed between earth and sky. The mares and colts grazed placidly. The movement of a stallion's head when he is searching the wind is something to see. Never still a moment, swinging, lifting higher, higher, even straight up to the sky, the nostrils wide and pulsing. He covers the ground at a swift, effortless trot or canter, always in a circle, so that he misses no inch of the field of scent. At last Banner, on one of his wild circles, caught the unmistakable scent of his master, halted, swung around and headed for the approaching horsemen, but wide of them and behind, so that, as Rob kept glancing backwards and to the sides, well knowing what to expect, he suddenly saw the stallion in pursuit of them, coming more sedately now, cautious, with his high springing trot and his steady eye fixed on them. He was full of questions and looked to Rob for the answers. What was up? Was he to bring the mares in? Was the band to be moved to another pasture, or was it to be just an exhibition? The men drew rein and turned to meet him. Both Sargent and Harris had seen the horse on former occasions, but it was impossible not to feel excitement and to respond with altered expressions as the intelligent animal drew near, taking in the group with pricked ears and investigating curiosity. Rob had often wondered how the stallion read his thoughts, possibly by the swing and tilt of his body as he rode. Close observation will disclose how continuously the body, by 100 little movements, indicates thoughts and intentions, or possibly it was by the direction of his glances, to a certain extent, of course, by his words and the tone of his voice and definite signals. "Look at him," exclaimed Charlie Sargent, "the son of a gun." "Some horse," said Harris, "came up behind us." Rob said, "His mares are probably back yonder." He gestured over his shoulder. "No oats for you today, old boy." Banner knew that already. There were never oats when his master came a horseback. Only when he came in the automobile. Rob added, "Where's your family?" and turning slowly, caught sight of the band of mares a mile away. He touched spur to his horse. "There they are. Want to see them, Mort?" "I sure do." They cantered over the range, the stallion following, running in half circles around them, crowding close, sniffing at each of the horses. As they drew rein near the band of mares, Charlie's gelding swung around to face Banner, and they spoke, half squeal, half grunt. Both of them reared, and suddenly Charlie was having trouble in keeping his seat, as the two began a playful fight, striking at each other with their forefeet, nipping over the head, trying for the neck. "They're old friends," said Rob, grinning. Charlie leaned out and made a swing at the stallion. "Get away with you, you brute!" Banner gave a start and bounded away, but in a few seconds was back again, this time sniffing at the mare Harris rode, sidling up to her, crowding close. Suddenly he lunged at her. Colonel Harris drew her away and shouted at the stallion. Banner circled, came back with head low, snaking along the grass, and Rob and Charlie grinned, pulled up their horses and watched. The mare was receiving commands from two quarters, from her rider, who held her forcibly back and commanded her to cease her play with the stallion and to stand still, from Banner, whose single lunge had been enough to tell her what he wanted, and who now followed it up by nipping her hind legs. Frightened and helpless, she obeyed the stallion. In vain, Colonel Harris tugged on the reins. In another second, Banner had forced her into a gallop, driving her straight into his band of mares. Rob and Charlie followed slowly, broad grins on their faces. You wouldn't think that a man who had spent his life on horseback would be apt to get a brand new riding experience, but it looks to me like that's what's going on. "I'm just as glad I'm not on that mare," said Sergeant joyously. Taggart and her rider were lost in the group of mares, which closed up when Banner gave the command. He circled them rapidly, head down, teeth bared, mane tossing over his eyes. Rob took a whistle out of his pocket and blew it. The stallion and all the mares halted and looked at him. Rob turned and began to trot back towards the ranch. He held one arm high. "Come on, Banner, bring him in." He broke into a gallop, Charlie following close. The stallion wheeled and began the roundup of his mares. Rob spurred his horse to a faster pace, saying, "I'll just as soon keep ahead of them." But it was impossible. Long before they had reached the bottom of the slope, the band of mares with the stallion driving them, and Harris, hopelessly caught in the midst of them, were abreast of Rob and Charlie, leaving gullies, plunging down hills, sliding the drops, crowding each other. A spirit of wild fun infected the band. They broke out sideways, kicking and bucking. The lead mare kept her place, neck stretched out and jealously crowding any mare who challenged her. The colts were 3 or 4 months old now, and had had many such runs. They were fleet and sure-footed, leaped the ravens, tossed their heads, squealed and played. Rob and Charlie caught sight of Harris's white face and the sound of a single profane shout as he swept past them. Leaning back like a steeplechaser, he kept his seat and his knee grip, allowing his body to whip pliantly from side to side. Any guidance or control of his mount was out of the question, and he did not attempt it, merely held the reins and let her go. Charlie Sargent chuckled. Even an artilleryman don't often take part in such a charge as that. The mares disappeared over the crest of a rise, and then, for a few moments, all that Rob and Charlie could see was a cloud of dust above the mountainside. Howard and Ken had the gates to the pasture open. The mares knew the way. As Banner got them close, he slowed up. They made the turn. Presently, the stable sergeant and the colonel's orderly burst into exclamatory and profane speech, which expressed their admiration and astonishment at the sight of the red stallion bringing the band of mares and colts at a headlong gallop down through the pasture and into the corral. Gus closed the gates. Only then did 2 soldiers see that their colonel was in the band. He was dismounting from Taggart, straightening his hat with a hand that trembled slightly. His face was very white. Gus took the mare's bridle. "Some ride," he remarked, brushing himself off, for he was covered with dust and foam and bits of gravel. The orderly presented himself and saluted. "Where's the mare?" asked Harris. He might have saved himself the question, for Banner was already rearing and pawing at the gate of the eastern corral. The men opened the gate and the stallion went in. Charlie and Rob rode down to the corral with innocent faces, and the colonel met them, impassive, thoughtful as ever, his eyeglasses neatly on the bridge of his nose. "You yelled something as you passed us," said Rob. I didn't quite catch it." The colonel grinned. "You may not have heard, just as well you didn't, but you knew what I was saying all right. However, it's over now, and it's all right. It's all right." He turned away grinning. "Quite an experience. I wouldn't have missed it." "Makes you feel good now, Mort, don't it?" said Charlie. "To be standing here in the corral, all safe and sound, and on your own two legs. Nice sunshine, dinner coming up." "Dinner coming up in more ways than one, to judge by the look of him," grinned Rob. "I must have been asleep at the switch when I let you two hand me that mare." Ken and Howard arrived at a gallop and flung themselves off their horses. The sergeant and orderly were blanketing with the mare again, and Banner was put back with his own mares by Tim. Gus and Tim filled the feed boxes, which stood on the ground near the corral fence, with oats, and the mares and colts began to feed. There was nipping and kicking and some scrimmages. Rob supervised the process, his harsh voice quelling the disturbances. He had Banner's share of oats, a generous half-bucketful in his hand, and the stallion would put his head in cautiously, his eyes looking up over the edge into Rob's face, then withdrew it and chewed the oats, turning his head to watch the mares, then dip it in again and take another mouthful. The process of covering his eyes and nose, upon which depended the safety of his mares, outraged his every instinct, and he shook all over. Only his trust of Rob made it possible. At last Rob dropped to the bucket and told Tim to open the corral gates. "That's all," he said to Banner. "There isn't any more." He gently raised his arms and advanced towards the mares, as it were, pushing them before him. "Take 'em back, Banner," he said to the stallion. The band drifted slowly through the gates and began to graze on the long lush grass beside the little stream. "What'll they do now?" asked Harris. "They'll hang around the corral for a while, grazing and thinking about oats. Then they'll work up through the pasture to the country road gate. It's open. They'll go through it and on up to the range again. Banner'll hold them together. Tim, keep a lookout. When they've all gone through the country road gate, close it." "Yes, sir." Ken saw his mother approaching. Now is the time, he thought. Everything over and everybody here together. The men grouped around the trailer, loading the colonel's mare. The sergeant and orderly got into the front seat of the car and drove away with her. The men stood watching a moment. "Dad," said Ken. "Well, son, I've got a surprise for you." "Sure enough. I've been saving it since last night." Everyone turned to look at him. He had their attention at last. "It's in the stable," he added. "Come and see." He seized his father's arm and urged him through the corral gate. Suddenly Rob guessed. "Not Flicker's colt?" he asked. Ken nodded, beaming, his blue eyes shining with excitement. "Yep." Rob explained to the others. "Ken's saddle mare should have foaled in the spring. She's been up here in the pasture all summer like Sitting Bull, waiting for the event, swelling up like a balloon. It must be 14 months. "You wait here," said Ken excitedly, when they were all in the corral. "I'll bring them out. They're in the stable." In a moment the stable door opened. Flicker trotted out. Then, for a space, nothing. Flicker turned and looked back and nickered. Still nothing. At last an angry little squeal was heard, and Ken appeared, shoving the white foal before him. Absolute silence greeted this apparition. Rob's jaw dropped. His eyes popped. Nell was the first to speak. "Why, Kenny," she exclaimed, "a white colt." Charlie Sargent found his tongue and with delight in his eyes looked at Rob. "I suppose this is an example of Banner's true breeding. I remember you said, 'One sorrel after another, as like as peas in the pod.'" He turned to Mort Harris and said sadly, "I sure do sympathize most deeply with your bad luck, Mort. Your mare." Harris gave a howl and turned and looked in the direction the car and trailer had gone, then seized his head and pretended to tear his hair. Ken was caught in one of those agonizing moments of life where extravagant hopes and deep despair were somehow reconciled by wishful thinking. Also, he was trying with all his wits to think of a way to suggest to them that this was a happy event. Also, he was on the watch for anything his mother would say. for from out of her first words the colt would be named. Also, he must keep his guilty secret. "Isn't he a beauty?" he cried happily. "And a white horse is good luck, you know. Everybody knows that." Rob's face was convulsed. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead. "Ken," he began, but there was nothing to say. Flickernickered again for her baby. He started to run towards her, saw Highboy standing against the fence with reins loosely thrown over a post, and ran to him instead and tried to nurse on him. A shout of amusement and incredulity rose from the spectators. Highboy, annoyed, moved away from the foal, turned around and butted it gently. The foal stood, bleating. Then it ran to Cigarette and tried to nurse on her. Flicker called it, unavailingly. When it passed near its mother, it seemed to recognize no difference in her from the others. Nell's face showed horror. "Why, it doesn't know its own mother." The foal surged about the corral. "A white horse is good luck," repeated Ken desperately. "Gus said so. Everybody knows that." Rob found words at last. "A throwback," he exclaimed disgustingly. He looked at Ken, one of those blasting looks which Ken could not meet. Somehow it was his fault. Nell was studying the foal. It did not look like the Goose Bar colts. A newborn foal of pure breed is built on the perpendicular, its little back so short that all four legs seem to be in a close group underneath it, and the neck continues the perpendicular line, carried straight up to a small inquiring head like a seahorse's. But this foal was built on the horizontal like a full-grown horse. It had a repellent look of precociousness and maturity, with its heavy neck and the big knobbly head on the end of it, a large mouth with thick, rather loose back lips, the short, uneven legs. "Why," she exclaimed in a shocked voice, "it's a goblin." The blood rushed to Ken's head and made him dizzy. He went to the corral fence and took hold of the rails to steady himself. No one spoke for a moment. Goblin, she had named it. "Goblin," shouted Howard. "Goblin, goblin, goblin!" But Ken was not licked yet. He turned to his mother. He would pretend it was just a word. He would pretend that she hadn't named it. "Mother, would you think of a name for him?" he pleaded. "Something about his being white, and about his going to be a wonderful racehorse." "Racehorse!" The exclamation was a chorus. Suddenly Ken's face flamed. He looked at his father. "You said there might be one gentle one in the lot, and you'd have a racehorse. And Flicker did get gentle. I gentled her, as gentle as a kitten. You said that too. And then, because of her bad leg, she couldn't be a racehorse, and it had to be her colt instead of her. And here he is. And he's a horse colt, and he's big and strong, and he's got her blood and her speed, and the speed and spirit of all the albino's colts. And his mother will teach him manners because she is gentle, so he can be schooled and trained for a racehorse. He won't be hard to handle, even if he has got a white coat from the albino." "The albino was his great-grandsire," explained Nell to Sergeant. "And Banner's his sire," drawled Sergeant. "Now what about all Rob's theories of line breeding? He bred Flicker back to her own sire, and look what he got." But Rob was looking at his small son, standing there red in the face and with fire in his eye, fighting for his foal. And the anger went out of his heart, and a silent cheer was there instead. "Good for you, son." "Name him, Mother," insisted Ken desperately. "Give him a name that will be right for a big winner of races. And something about his being white." "Cottage cheese," yelled Howard derisively. And then, mincing about delicately, "or cream puff." "Pearl of the harem," joshed Sergeant. "Mooly cow," exclaimed Howard, and cantered awkwardly across the corral. "Somebody stop that guy or he'll go on forever," said Rob, making a pass at Howard. Howard ducked, but fell into the arm of Sergeant, who grabbed him and clapped his hand over his mouth. Nell had not spoken. Ken watched her. Mother, he urged her. Go on, Mother. Sergeant let go of Howard, who, casting a glance at his father, decided he had gone far enough. There was an ache in Nell's heart. She looked at the foal, that stubbornness, the mulish head, that stupidity, trying to nurse on every horse in sight. Not knowing his own mother and its anger, it ran across the corral, head down, kicking out with one hind leg. It seemed full of hatred. Mother, insisted Ken. In despair, Nell raised her eyes and saw, up behind the line of the green hill, a great thunderhead pushing up into the dark blue of the sky. It was so dazzling white, it half blinded her. There, she said calmly. See that? A thunderhead, and it's pure white. We'll call him Thunderhead, Ken. And that's a fine enough name for any racehorse. No one spoke. The silence was like a cool shadow on a hot, dusty day. Ken stood quiet, feeling weak. The name was so beautiful. Thunderhead. He looked at the great cloud and turned away so that the others could not see his face. Thunderhead. That would carry the colt to glory. With that name, what horse could fail? The colt, still making little rushes about the corral, kicking and bleating, came up against the group of people by the fence. He had no fear of them. An ordinary colt would have veered away, but Colonel Harris got it by the neck and was nipped and let it loose. Nell pulled out her hand. The foal careered against her, and for a moment its face was hidden and there was darkness, that welcome and familiar darkness of all the long months inside its mother. He pressed closer and stood quiet. A strange feeling went through Nell. He was ugly, and she had miscalled him, and they had all laughed at him. But here he was turned to her, and a rush of protective compassion went through her. She put her hand on his neck and stroked him. Panting slightly, his sides going in and out, his chunky legs splayed out comically. He leaned against her, hiding his eyes from the world and from people. It's the end of chapter 5.